YouTube. Okay, that is this code. And so Latonia's question was, why did we add index here on our message list sent message? And so we added that functionality because when we tried to make our either our edit clicked or our delete clicked work, we needed to know what was being clicked on, what sent message was being edited. And so we used the props.index here to know which edit button was being clicked. So you may ask, okay, well, I understand why you need the index, but why do you need the index as its own prop? Because you already have the index getting sent in as the key. And the reasoning behind that is React doesn't like you borrowing this key and using it 2 times. React is like, hey, key is special to me. If you would like to use that data that you are using as the key, pass it in as another prop, because we don't want you really using the key anywhere else. So if you are using it anywhere else, just pass it in as a secondary prop. That answer your question? Cool. All right. Other questions that people have?
I have a question.
Sure.
When we do the delete, are we supposed to get rid of the whole little thing with the bubble, or is that okay that that's staying?
You should delete. So the way delete should work is you should be able to make a request to the backend using fetch and the appropriate method. You should have the endpoint set up with an app.delete. You should delete it out of the array, and then you should send the messages back once it's been deleted out of the array. And then switching back over to your front end, you should parse that JSON out and then update the messages array in state.
Okay.
And so I am guessing you got everything done up into the sending the messages back to the front end and getting the state to update based off of what messages get sent back.
Yeah, like it's working, but I did not do anything with state, I don't think. So that could be the issue.
Yep. And so if you look in our update method, we do update the state based off of what data comes back from the server. So you should be able to borrow most of that code in the delete as well.
Okay.
I'm so glad I got to the mute before I sneezed, because my microphone is about an inch away from my mouth, and that would not have been fun for anyone. Other questions?
My set messages is not getting passed into sent message.
Okay, do you want to share your screen?
Sure. Let me move this over first. So I've been console logging it in various places, and it's coming in here, and it's coming in there, and it's not coming in here. I get an error.
Because you need your props.set message there.
Oh, okay.
Because it doesn't know, it's like set messages, where is set messages coming in from? And it is coming in from your props object on line 30.
Right. Okay, so I need that there, but the problem is it wasn't working here. So I guess I could try doing props that sent messages there too, and then,
And then, yeah, if you save that and test that code while you're screen sharing, let's make sure that fixes it because it looks like it should be working.
because I was getting an error when I tried to edit something, so. So yeah, that's coming through.
Okay, so
Oh.
go ahead and try and edit a message and let's see if it works.
All right, I can move our faces here. All right. Yeah.
Okay. So different error that we are now getting a cannot read property map of undefined. And it is telling you that on line 43, it's the props.set messages that kicks this
Yeah,
whole
that's where I
problem
got
off.
that from.
So
Mhm.
let's go back to your code.
Okay.
We're gonna comment out your props.set message.
The
on
console log, you mean?
No, on 43.
Oh, okay.
We're gonna comment that out and we're gonna console log out our data instead.
Okay.
And then save that, pop over to the browser and try and edit a message.
Oh, it's not even coming up anymore.
Uh,
Oh, no, it is. Okay. It's just a small bubble. That's why.
okay, and then pop open your console.
Yep.
And all right, so we get our array, but
Right.
you notice our array doesn't
Oh.
have dot messages. It's just the array.
Okay.
So if we go over to our backend code, if you can pull that up.
Yes. I don't know if it's the right size. I'm gonna try to make it smaller before I move it over to the other screen here. Okay.
Okay, so if we go to where our edit endpoint is,
That was
our
the put,
post,
right? Yeah.
our put, yeah. So you notice up here, we've got our messages coming back on line 34 in an object.
Mm-hmm.
That is sending it back and saying, hey, anything in data.messages is going to contain our data. But instead of sending back the messages array in an object with a key called messages, down here, you just send the messages array itself.
Oh, okay.
And so that is why when you look at your console log now in the front end, it's giving you an array. It's not giving you an object with a key of messages and then the array as the value.
Okay, so
And
this
so
needs to be an object just like this.
you have two options. You can either make it an object, just like above what you just said, or if you go over to your front end, you can say, oh, instead of looking for data.messages, just look at the data itself because data is the array of messages.
Okay.
And so if you uncomment that line and just make it data, it should work. And so that's a good example of it doesn't matter what you're sending back as long as it's matching on the front end in the back end.
Okay.
Now, I would say for consistency reasons, this isn't the better way to do it. The better way to do it is to send back that array of in the object that has messages in it, only because it is very likely that you would want to send back more than just one piece of data.
Right.
You may have several objects, but let's prove that this works. So save, go to your front end, refresh, and then try and edit a message.
Guess I'll edit it. Well, it's small like this. Oh, wait a minute. Not send a message, edit. I think I have to get out of here to do that. Okay. Yes, that works.
There you go.
All right, thanks. I think I'm going to change it to the other way though.
Totally fine either way. Other questions?
Actually, while I was trying to fix that and I had all those console logs in there, I noticed that I actually changed the timeout thing or whatever it was called, the load messages to set interval. That's what it was called. I changed it to a minute because I had it at like 3 seconds and I noticed that it was console logging like every 3 seconds. Is that actually, it's not reloading them, right? It's just, I mean, is it changing the display every 3 seconds or?
No, so React is being super smart and it's saying, oh, all of these keys are the same. And so there's nothing to re-render here because you're literally setting the data to the same exact data that I already have loaded. What it is doing every 3 seconds is asking your backend server, hey, can you send me the messages? And the messages are getting sent from your backend server to your React server. And then React is saying, well, this state isn't any different, so I don't need to re-render any of this. So not a major concern. If you set it to 1 millisecond, then you might start seeing the browser be like, whoa, can't get data that fast. Hold your horses. But every 3 seconds, while it seems like a lot to us, is probably not a lot for the computer. Sarah sent in a good question. She's not able to make it tonight, but she read something that says, an Express application is essentially a series of middleware function calls. So we dabbled with middleware a tiny little bit in Express. We used both body parser and cores. And so to give you a little more there is, middleware is anything you can think of a request coming in and running down a chain before it finally hits our code down at the bottom, right? So the request comes in and Express looks at our server and goes, okay, before we run the code in this endpoint, there are other things that we would like to do in the middle of that execution before we go run that final code and res.send it out. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use cores. And we're going to look at cores and say, oh, we're allowing requests from anywhere. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, now let's use body parser. Body parser is going to use the header information. It's going to use content type. It's going to see its application.json. It's going to parse it out. And that means that now rec.body is filled. So when we get out of our middleware and get to our actual code running, rec.body is nicely filled in for us. We will be covering middleware more in depth after we come back to module 7. So we're going to do module 8. Next week will be all about database design and SQL. The following week is still module 8, but we're going to do more hands-on, more talking about how we can integrate our database in with our node and our server. And then we are going to finally come back to module 7, and we're going to have 2 weeks to cover more advanced Express concepts, but with the database under our belt, so we get to build more realistic hands-on projects. So Sarah asked a great question about middleware. We will definitely be covering it more later, but choosing to not go too far in depth in it now, knowing that we will be covering it in class in 3-ish weeks. Okay, now I'm officially out of content, so I will wait for questions. You didn't think it was possible to shut me up, did you?
Hey Max, this is Shao. I have a
Hey.
question. So we have been using modules like cores or apps. So how do you know when to use them? Let's say you are coding and you see something. So how do you decide? Do you Google or do you know, or you just, doing it yourself, building it yourself versus using cores or something like that? So how would you?
Yeah, great question. So I'm gonna do an experiment on the fly. I have no idea what the results are going to be, but we're gonna try it and we're gonna see what's gonna happen. So I'm going to share my screen and we are going to say, all right, we ran into that cores issue on day 1, right? We had or maybe day 2 of this. We had our Express server all set up. We were trying to get add to work. but because our React front end was on a different port than our React back end, CORS was blocking it and saying you can't do that. So I'm going to do a search. You could type in node. Express is probably more accurate of what we're looking to do here. And we're going to say express disable CORS. And the first thing that comes up is express.js. So right from the horse's mouth, so to speak. But you also see Stack Overflow is here. So let's just try that. So if we scroll down, they give us the, I don't like that answer. I'm going back to the official answer. So I'm going to go over to Express, and you see the first thing they do is they say CORS is a Node.js package. So whenever we see package, we go, okay, we need to install that. And then they're making it even more explicitly clear by giving you the install command and an example of how to pull in the CORS package. So in that situation, you would just Google CORS Express, and the first thing that comes up says, here's this package, go use the package. One thing to check is if you click on NPM here or go to npm.js and look at CORS, you can pop this open and see that it's got 5 million weekly downloads. That is, I think 10 to 15 million is the biggest that I have seen. But there are times that you will look at a package and it's got like 4, not 4,000, not 40,000, just 4. And so when you see 4 weekly downloads, that's when you start to go, I don't know if this code is well tested. I don't know if there are security vulnerabilities with it. I would be hesitant to install a package that only has 4 installations. But the fact that this has 5 million a week, that tells me, hey, there are enough people using this that I'm not going to be generally concerned about it. So I happen to know, oh, I need body parser to get the JSON working. And if I pull open body parser, we see body parser has 17 million weekly downloads, right? So not something we need to be concerned about. But if you did a search for express JSON body and look, first thing that comes up, express body parser middleware. And so we pop that open and we see they're telling us the same thing, install body parser. They're giving us the require input, and then they're even telling us, hey, use body parser.json. So a lot of times you will know just based off of what the documentation tells you to do, hey, there's already a package for this, you need to pull it in. Sometimes it isn't just the back end. Sometimes it's the front end where you go, hey, someone else has probably styled a button to make it look good and make it hover properly and do all of that. I wonder if Bootstrap has a button for me. Or, oh, I'm designing this list and I'm adding all of this CSS styling. There's probably something I can use that already makes a list look pretty good, or a table or whatever it is. So whenever you get that gut feeling of like, someone else has probably already done this and formatted their code in a way that I can use it, that is when the package warning light should be going off and you start to think, maybe I can go find a package for this. Sometimes you get into your code so far and you go, I didn't think this would be so complicated, but now that I'm realizing how complicated it is, I wonder if I should go look for a package for this. The best example for that is probably date and times, where you go, oh, it's just a date and time, no big deal. I want to format this, no problem. And then you go, oh, wait, I forgot about time zones. And you go, all right, well, I'll just add or subtract a couple hours on that and I'm good to go. And then you go, oh, but wait, there are some time zones that are 3.5 hours from Greenwich Mean Time, not just 1 hour off. Or, oh, what happens when the time zone changes and they decide to move to a different time zone? Or, oh, what happens in the 1600s when we start using a Gregorian calendar and add 3 months to dates? All of those concerns are things where you go, this is a tough problem to solve, but it's a big enough issue that someone has probably already solved it. And that's when you start thinking, all right, I should go look at packages. I may need to compare a couple different packages. I may need to read their documentation to compare them. And then I will be able to choose and use which one to use from there. So there's a lot of discussion that happens amongst us instructors about what packages we are going to use. So when we changed up who was teaching module 8 this week, that kicked off a big discussion of, should I be teaching MySQL or should I be teaching Postgres? And they are both based in SQL. They both use the same syntax, but under the hood, two completely different databases. And so I have a personal preference on them, and I have one that I use at work. But I ran that by the instructors and I said, hey, does anyone have a preference? You know, does someone think that it's going to be better for the students to learn one over the other? There are times that the instructors will basically say what they did for this decision of, I don't care, whatever one you want to teach, they're pretty much the same. There are other decisions that sometimes cause a huge blow up, and there are big fights over whether we should be using this package, if this package is better. We talked a little bit about tabs and spaces. That kind of butting heads in programming happens all the time, because for whatever reason, people who are supposed to be very logical as programmers often tend to be very opinionated. And so you will hear debates all the time about React versus Angular and why one is better than the other, or they both accomplish the same thing. Whatever you can do in one, you can do in the other. But there will definitely be opinions formed by professional developers who spend hours and hours a day in these frameworks or these packages or whatever it is, where they think one is better than the other. So to answer your question, Shaul, whenever you get that gut feeling of, wow, this is getting complicated, someone else probably has already solved this for me, that is when you start to think, oh, I should use a package. We kind of obfuscate some of that. We kind of solve some of that for you by, when we're teaching, we happen to have this package already prepared and we happen to know what commands to run right off of it. But in the real world, you would be on NPM, you would be researching different options, you would try a package, you would be reading their documentation to figure out how to use the package. And then you may go through that entire process and spend 3 days learning that package and realize that it doesn't do what you need it to, or you get really frustrated with that package and end up having to go to a alternative or a competitor, if you want to think of it as that way, and try that process all over again of reading their documentation, understanding how they are doing it, and trying it. There are times that you can make that decision just by reading the documentation alone or comparing the number of downloads. There are definitely times that I have tried a new package, invested 2 weeks into it, realized how terrible it was, and had to spend an additional week just scrapping all of the old code and going back to a package that I had known. So there are huge time consequences in choosing the wrong package or choosing to build it all out from scratch when a package has already been built. So very long-winded answer, but hopefully it does answer your question.
Thank you, it does, yes, yeah.
Perfect.
Like formatting the phone number would be something that, I mean, you can go look it up or Google it and just copy the code.
Yeah, and so that's a interesting point of, all right, do I write the code myself? Do I go on Google and it's only a couple lines of code, so I'm just gonna copy and paste it? Or do I go find an NPM package that is doing this for me and pull it in from NPM? And I would be inclined to do that, especially if you're looking at a package that has like 10,000 plus weekly installs, because in those 10,000 people using the package, likely they have already solved for things that you may not run into right off the bat, like what happens if the phone number isn't in the US, or what if that phone number has extra digits in it, or what happens if they include the country code instead of just the area code, or what happens if they don't include the area code, right? And so now all of a sudden you're you're getting out of just a couple lines of code or just a regex that you can copy and paste, and are getting into more of a couple hundred lines of code, in which place you should be thinking, maybe I should just go find a package that I can pull in, as opposed to just copying and pasting something.
Thanks. Max, sorry, can I ask another question if no one else has a question? So looking at the React, so the fact that it's component based and you create components, and also you mentioned like there are lots of modules and apps. So does it increase collaboration among developers? Like with JavaScript, if you look at the chat app, I mean, that was a huge document, but if you compare that to React, and especially if you develop different components, so does it make it easier to collaborate, and also kind of the availability of it to other developers?
Absolutely. Yeah, great question. For sure, it definitely does. If you think of Bootstrap, right? And you go, oh, I don't like that, this button doesn't have a hover style effect, right? When I put my mouse over it, I would like it to turn a little slightly darker blue. And you know what? It's doing that in Chrome and it's doing it in Firefox, but it's not doing it in Safari. So you go in, you figure out why it's not doing it in Safari, and you go, well, I can fix this in my code, but everyone using Bootstrap should be able to have this little style tweak. It works in the other browsers, it doesn't work in Safari. So if you were to go into Bootstrap CSS, there would literally be, I don't know, 50,000 lines of CSS in there. And you would be like, no way, I know how to fix this. I fixed it in my own code. There is no way I can go through 50,000 lines of CSS and find where to fix it. But if Bootstrap were broken up, which they do break up their CSS with something called partials because they use Sass under the hood. If I could go in and just open up button.css and just see the couple hundred lines that control that button, I am more likely to then go put that fix in and then open what is called a pull request. And the pull request is a Git concept where you're basically saying, hey, I would like you to pull these code changes that I have made into the master code base. So when someone else downloads this, they will have my fixes in there, right? So it makes sense that you can't PULL. You're pulling it in. You're not pulling it all. Because the opposite of a pull is a push, right? And so you are pulling it in, and you're basically requesting it, because it makes sense that you can't go in, change some code at Bootstrap and just push it out to every single person that is using Bootstrap, right? That would be security nightmare, stability nightmare, all kinds of nightmares. But basically you can change the code and request that changed code to be pulled back into the project. So when that is approved, it rolls out everywhere. So I can tell you a little backstory on this as an example. There is a rich text editor package called Draft.js. And Draft.js is used on Facebook. So whenever you type a comment and you do your little @ symbol, you get the autocomplete of friends you can tag or whoever it is. So it is used in pretty much every input on Facebook.com. Well, there was a problem in that code where it had something to do with spaces. After you had tagged someone, it was inserting 2 spaces in after the tag instead of just 1. Well, we at the time were using that Draft.js rich text editor in code at work. And it was driving me crazy that it was inserting the 2 extra spaces, but it was only doing it in Safari. And so I ended up digging into that code, figuring out where to fix it. I fixed it in my own code, But then I looked right on, I literally opened up facebook.com and tagged someone and saw 2 spaces showing up after the tag. And I'm like, oh, this is a problem in the entire package. This isn't just something that's wrong in the code, how we have implemented it. So I went in, I changed that code in the source code. I opened up a pull request at Trap.js. It took a couple days. It got approved, and now I can say that I have written code that is running on facebook.com, right? Yes, it was a little one-line fix. It wasn't a big deal, but that's kind of the beauty of open source, is that you can change the code. And the entire idea of the open source community is that it is a community, of that if you want to contribute to open source, you can make those changes, and Git has a process in place for approving that, merging it back into the code. And eventually, like a month later, I could literally right-click inspect on facebook.com and see the line of code that I had changed. And so I can actually say that I've written code that, facebook.com uses, even though that's such a little minor thing.
Thank you.
And a lot of developers will say that getting started in open source is what actually landed them their job. So being able to put on their resume, like, hey, I've actually worked in an open source team, or, I worked on this feature that was already on their roadmap. They needed additional help with it. So after the program, while you guys are still job hunting, if you are looking for ways to get more experience, finding a project that you really believe in, Free Code Camp is probably like the easiest example to think of off the top of my head. Free Code Camp is all open source. So if you go through the Free Code Camp curriculum and you think, I think this exercise would be better worded if, we change this, or, anything in your Free Code Camp experience, you can learn how to join their open source community, actually write code, submit it. And not only is that helping Free Code Camp, now you can put on your resume, hey, I've worked with this open source project and I've gotten actual real world experience writing code. Ariel, question.
I was just wondering if I could share my screen. I had my fetch messed up and I attempted to fix it, and now I'm not quite understanding the error for promises.
Go for it.
Okay. I'm not sure how. Oh, I have to go back to Zoom for that, don't
You do.
I? So this is the current error I have.
Okay, so unexpected token arrow in JSON at position 0 tends to be that you're not sending valid JSON back, but let's start at your front end code.
Okay. What am I looking at here? So it was originally coming up, the error was fetch.
Okay.
So I'm not sure what I have missed or messed up here. So I took the notes you had for Kyle's, but it's something in that area.
You're on the right track.
Fetch.
So let's switch to your server.js file.
Okay. Yeah, I lost it when I put everything together on this one.
You actually have it open in another tab already.
Oh, yep. Thank you. Yeah, it's right there. Okay.
Okay. So what is the endpoint we are using to retrieve the messages?
As far as the listening?
Nope. Just what is the endpoint that we set up to send the messages back in the response?
No, I couldn't tell you at this point.
Let me word it like this. What gets the messages?
Oh, we're sending them through the other port. Is that not what you're asking still?
No, I'm asking what what the route name is that we send the messages back through.
Oh, we have put and then we have get.
Yep. So go up to your get.
Okay.
And
Which
that
one we're looking at?
That isn't getting the messages. That is your route, your ROOT route. because it's just at the slash.
Okay.
But
So-
you do have an endpoint created. That's another get endpoint that is sending the messages back. If you scroll up a little bit, it is right there on line 26.
But I don't have it on this one.
Two separate endpoints.
That's what okay. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Your one on 26 is set up properly, right? You're saying, hey, the route name is messages, and I'm going to res.send my messages back through that route.
Right here. Okay.
Right. And so that's the endpoint we want to be using.
So what am I, but I still need this one, I thought, right?
You don't technically need it, but it's a good idea to have it in case anyone goes to localhost 3001. You want to be able to send something back at the root route.
So would this typically be a 404 at that point?
If
Like
you
if you did it
didn't,
manually?
if you didn't have the root route in there, it would 404.
Okay. That makes more sense then, because I didn't get this far into it. I just know the fetch is my main issue, but I couldn't tell where it was coming
Yeah.
from.
So if you look at line 26, you have your endpoint set up properly. And
For messages.
and the endpoint route name is messages.
Mhm.
So that's
Okay.
what we want to be using in our front end, right? Again, just all an exercise of matching things up. So let's go back over to your front end. And looking at your fetch on line 10, what route are we using currently?
I have set messages, but I don't have.
Nope, on line
Here's
10,
a separate.
only on line 10.
I'm sorry. I'm looking right up at above it. Yeah, I've got the local host, but I don't have it going to messages.
And so what you are getting instead is the root route. So we need to add in a slash messages there, which is going to tell your front end, hey, go get the right endpoint.
Which now I would have to change that back for the other fetch as well, wouldn't I? I have another one. I want to say that was in message though.
Message input probably. Yep. So here you also want to be posting two messages.
So that it is connected, which is how your like the GitHub was, but I was having issues prior. So I thought because that was fetch, that was where my issue was.
So go ahead and save that. And so the reason, and then refresh, and hopefully you get your messages in here.
Let me close out of this first. My Zoom is in the way.
Okay, that did not fix it. So let's pop open your console and see if we have any errors in there. Oh, Susan, good catch. So we're still having an issue. So let's go back over to our code. And what port is our backend server running on?
It should be 3001.
Okay, and what are we fetching to?
3000.
So
What? Okay, so this is where my original issue was, but I'm not changing all of them. So for example, I would go into, I'm sorry, my Zoom bar ended up here at the top. So where am I? Message list, I want input.
you do need to change all of them to 3001.
So even if they're all set, because that's what I originally had changed from, they're all going to be 3001 because they're all trying to connect to the back end. They're fetching from the back end.
Correct.
So then that, okay. Okay. Another one in here? No, it's my app.
Susan, if it gives you a confidence boost, you caught that before I did.
Yeah, thank you, because this is a missing one. Well, I can play with it now that I know. Which
Well,
other one
don't
am I
leave us
missing?
hanging. Go test your code and see if the messages show up.
I only changed two. I'm missing one. Server?
In
No?
the message list, we have it on edit and delete.
Oh, okay.
There it is.
So I would need to do this as messages as well.
Yep. So you need a slash messages and then another slash in there. There you go.
Just to make sure it, okay. So then this one as well. I knew there was another one I missed somewhere.
There is to do the global find and replace in VS Code. I believe it's Command Shift F, and that will allow you to search all the places you may have localhost.
Okay, yeah, Joey showed us that last week, but I haven't. I'm still trying to catch on to the screen shot.
Carolyn, F is in find.
Okay.
And then refresh. Nope, still the same problem. All right, let's go to the console.
I've broken something somewhere.
All right, and now we've got an connection refused. So connection refused to me tells me that your backend probably isn't running. So let's go to your backend code. What you probably need to do is just pop open, if you right click on server.js and then open it in an integrated terminal, we are going to run npx nodemon server.js.
Which one was it? Nodemon what? I'm sorry.
Server.js. And now we are listening on 3001. So if we go back over to the browser, we've got messages.
So my whole issue this entire time was I didn't run npx in the backend when I opened this today.
Correct.
That was my entire issue today.
Well,
that and I had the wrong port to begin with, but I mean, like this would have.
Yep.
Okay, buddy. All right. Thank you.
I would like to tell you that I have not wasted hours of my life trying to debug something and realize the server is not running. But when you have 10 years of professional full stack experience, you realize that it's literally all those minutes of just realizing the server is not running adds up to hours and hours of just. But again, senior developer does not mean that you make less errors. It just means you know how to fix them quicker.
So when I go to move it to my own, then I'm going to have to run it every time for the 3000 and the 3001 because it's obviously two different servers we have connected there. So
and they'll auto reboot when you make changes to them. But whenever you close out of VS Code and reopen your code, you also have to go reboot your servers.
Which is what I did today. Okay, thank you.
No problem. Other questions? All good ones so far. Like I said, I'm not afraid to tell you if you are asking a stupid question. No stupid questions so far.
This may be the first one. So I'm trying to figure out how to better understand what file I'm supposed to be in when I'm following these directions about put this for this component and you know how you're working between files. Just can you help me try to figure out how to better understand what content goes in what file?
Yeah, so probably the most complicated thing to figure out of where it should be is your state, right? And so in our example, when you initially start working with React, you would go, oh, we have our messages. It would make sense that our messages would go in our messages list, right? That's where they're all going to show up. But now we run into this problem of, well, when I send a message, I would like that to show up in my list as well. And so it is very hard, unless you're using the context API, or use context, which is the hook. It is very hard to have data in a child component pass that data to a child that shares the same parent, right? There's no way for our message input to send data to our messages list unless we take the state that is in messages list and move it up to the parent component, which happens to be app. And now that we have moved our state up to the app, we can share that via props across our message input and our message list. And because we move the state up to our parent app, we are able to send a message in our message input and have it automatically update in our messages list. So probably should not have started with the most complicated answer, which is how do we know where to put things regarding state? State, you want to put it high enough up in the parent-child structure that whatever is going to need it is in the parent and not in the child, because we can't share state from child to child directly without flowing it through the parent. And that is because props are read-only, right? And we've got this data flow of, hey, we've got to update things in the parent, and then the parent is going to be responsible for telling the children, hey, here's the new data, you should go update. So that's the most complicated answer. The other answer is you kind of just have to do it case by case, right? So if you're doing an on click on a button, well, you think, all right, well, this button is in the component, so it probably makes sense that whatever this button is doing on the on click is going on in that component. And so it makes sense, okay, when I add an on click, I'm going to do that inside the component. Same thing goes for use state, right? Okay, this data is impacting this component. It makes sense that the state is going inside the component, not outside the component. Or if you think about use effect, what kind of data am I loading? I'm loading that data in where the state is. I'm passing it into the state. So it makes sense that my use effect would go in the same component that my state is going to go into. And so that goes inside of it. Now you can do that also in reverse. You can say, all right, this makes sense to me to be a standalone component. This is a couple lines of code. This is something I'm going to repeat. Maybe messages is the best example of this. We're going to show multiple messages received and multiple messages sent. So because we're going to reuse that, we should make that its own component and then import that in via another file. So whenever you have something that you know you are going to repeat, that's how you know, hey, I'm going to put this in a separate file. Whenever you have code that you can logically cluster together, that is when you should start thinking about, oh, that needs to either go in a separate component, or, oh, that needs to go in a separate function, or even maybe even a separate file. And I know that is a vague answer. I wish there was like a formula or an algorithm that I could tell you, like, if it's A, B, and C, then you definitely put it in a different file. But over time, you'll start to get the feel of, you'll start to pick up coding patterns that the instructors or Joey or whoever it is probably explicitly said to you, but it didn't click for whatever reason with not enough exposure. But then you'll you will start to see patterns in it of, oh, whenever I return from a component, that's always my HTML coming out. And whenever I use state, that return, because it has my state in the return, knows to auto update. And so, all right, it makes sense to me that what is being returned from the component is what actually shows up in the browser in that component, right? So like those little things where it's like, Joey may have covered that and he may have said that, but because you weren't writing code and writing your own components and returning the things right out, at when he said that, it may not have sunk in. So don't be afraid. Sometimes you get light bulb moments that you feel stupid that you had a light bulb moment, which is the exact opposite of what a light bulb moment is supposed to be, right? You're like, oh my God, I get it now. And then a very common reaction is, I'm so dumb that I didn't get it until now, right? And that's a very common reaction. And it took me a lot more than 3 weeks for me to say, I feel comfortable using React. I thought it was incredibly stupid that I couldn't update data in a prop. I thought it was incredibly stupid that I couldn't just pass data to another child. It's like, it's right there. But once you understand that data flow of it's got to go up to the parent, and the parent is keeping all the data, and then the parent is telling the children, hey, go update because my data changed, then all of a sudden it starts to make sense of like, oh, I need to put my state higher up. Carolyn, doesn't really matter which one you start first in terms of your back end or your front end. I tend to do my back end first because that makes my server listening for requests before my front end has a chance to go ask for that server. So technically should be the back end. But whenever you're writing production code in a fetch request, you start building in error handling, whether that's with a try request or dot catch, which is what you do with a promise, or you want to build out your front end code to basically say, hey, if the server is not responding, handle that properly, maybe display to the end user, hey, couldn't connect to server, or maybe throw it in the console, or you get better at setting up your front end code to handle when your back end code isn't available, which isn't just, oh, I forgot to start the server on the back end. It could be, the cloud that we hosted in is down, or I'm in the middle of deploying code, or we have thousands of users and the server just can't process that many requests, or there are a lot of reasons that you would want to build in fetch failures into your front end. Won't go too far into that, only because that's more advanced. But long story short, it makes a little bit more sense to start the back end before the front end, but not the end of the world if you forget one in front of if you do it in the opposite order.
Are there some things that you kind of need at least a small front end to test, or is that when you use Postman like we were doing?
You got it. You use Postman.
Okay.
And there are all of that stuff that I was just talking about of doing the API, doing the setup and handling the errors and all of that stuff. There's the complication of adding authentication on top of that. I'm saying, hey, only signed in users to my app should be able to access these API endpoints. And so the way you handle that in Express is with a middleware function, but then you also need to handle that on the front end. So the front end is sending to your back end, hey, by the way, I'm signed in and this is my user and here's the proof that I have signed in. And so what you end up doing is you make your API call almost its own component. And so you're using fetch inside of there, but then you're handling all the authentication and all of that stuff. So in your front end code, you can always just call in your custom API function, which is using fetch under the hood, but taking care of all the authentication and all of that stuff. So may have gotten a little too complicated there, but basically you end up building your own custom version of fetch that still is using fetch, but just has things like authentication and error handling built into it. And so once you have that component built and set up in a project, it almost becomes easier to create a component from scratch where you can just test your API calls as opposed to loading it up in Postman. But Postman is a perfectly fine option, and how most backend developers would test their functions and their endpoints without having to have a front end to test it in. For localhost 3000 says there's no real way to change that. We are using the built-in browser window.prompt, which is just a very big shortcut for us to be able to pop up an alert, get the input of it, and update it. So in a production app, I probably wouldn't use window.prompt. Instead, I would look to like the Bootstrap modal, because the Bootstrap modal is going to look a lot prettier on the page and is not going to block out any clicks behind it. And it's just going to be this very nice component that I can control all the styling of. I can add a title in the modal if I wanted to. I can add in things like if I wanted an image to show up. There's no way to get an image to show up in window.prompt. But if I'm controlling my modal from scratch, I'm able to style all of that. But then it becomes easily 100 lines of code to get the modal to show up, to add my input, to add state handling into my input, to make sure that When the modal closes, I have the text input still in the state, clearing out the text input, graying out the rest of the screen behind it. All of that is why it becomes 100 lines of code, even if you are using the modal that is built into Bootstrap. So that is why we use the shortcut of window.prompt, because it is entirely possible and what you should be doing for a production website. But when you just want to edit a quick message, you can cheat and use the built-in methods. That's also probably why you've never gotten an alert on a web page, right? Like if you're scrolling through a news article, you'll notice that the alert never pops up in the browser. Instead, it is a modal that will be, hey, subscribe to our newsletter or look at this ad or whatever it is. And then you hit the close button and it goes back to showing you the news article. Same idea there, is they have invested the time into making sure modals work as opposed to hooking into some native built-in browser event. Yes, totally more of an aesthetic thing. There are some concerns about using alert because it prevents you from interacting with the page behind it until you hit OK or cancel on that alert. So probably a little bit more than aesthetic because it is impacting the functionality of the site. But yes, 95% of it is an aesthetic thing.
Okay, thank you. No, I was just wondering because I noticed it came up and I was thinking about it. I'm like, I don't think I've seen a website come up with the URL in there. So I didn't know if you ever ended up changing that, if it was going to break what you had going, like it was trying to send it to a different place or anything like that. So thank you. That makes way more sense now.
Yep, just the browser building in some functionality that I did not want to build from scratch. There is some truth in the idiom that a lazy developer is a good developer, both in terms of using functionality that's already built into their programming language, and in terms of knowing when to go out and use an NPM package instead of building something from scratch. I would say, I don't know, 2/3 of the NPM packages that I use, I could build, right? There is nothing saying that I know everything that I need to know to go build a time parsing library. That does not mean that I should go out and build a time parsing library, right? That is something where it's like you should use someone else's package for that. There are definitely packages that I use where I'm like, that's voodoo. I have no idea how that works under the hood. I'm glad it works and I'm glad that it's well documented so I don't have to build that from scratch. But the vast majority of packages I use, you do get to the point of understanding how it's done, and you also come to respect that someone else has done it for you, right? If you guys look at Bootstrap now, there's nothing saying that you guys couldn't create your own version of Bootstrap, right? Like we made message components from scratch in module 4, right? We played with the styling, we added some border to it, we added a radius, we did our background color, we changed the text, and all of a sudden we have our message component. So technically you guys have all the knowledge that you need to go build your own version of Bootstrap. But that does not mean that you should be writing 50,000 lines of CSS to go make your own Bootstrap. Not to mention handling breakpoints and mobile responsiveness and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah. Other questions? I don't think I missed anything in the chat, but feel free to yell at me if I did. We do have only 2 more minutes left on office hours, but if you have a question, I'm happy to stay late and answer it.
Hi, Max, this is Shaw.
Yep.
So does your firewall affect sending messages like the chat app if your firewall or network settings?
Yeah, good question. Your firewall will almost never prevent one of your local hosts talking to another one of your local hosts because your servers that you're running on your computer are behind the firewall. So there's not an individual firewall around each one of your servers. There's just one firewall around your entire computer. and then you happen to be running your servers inside that firewall or behind that firewall. So there's nothing preventing localhost 3000 talking to localhost 3001 and vice versa, except for cores, which we are already covered. Your firewall may prevent another device on your network from talking to your computer. So if you try to load 192.168. and then whatever your IP address is on your computer on your phone, it may load and it may not. And that is when your firewall would prevent what we call an incoming connection, right? The firewall may block incoming connections that aren't originating from the computer itself. So it is possible that your firewall will prevent that. ngrok was supposed to be a solution to kind of punch through any of your firewalls and give you access on the internet to something that you are running locally. But it is entirely possible that your firewall is blocking other requests either from the internet or from other devices on your network, but it will rarely block servers you are running locally from talking to each other.
Thank you. It makes sense. Perfect. The reason I ask is last week the office, I had to connect my computer through desktop, and it gives me a very hard time. So I had to change the routers and other stuff, but it worked finally. I was able to connect to the office computer from the laptop.
Yeah, I seem to remember you having problems in Ryan's module as well, where everyone else was able to run code, but you had issues like on a certain port, and that very well could, it likely is not the firewall on your computer, it's the firewall running on the router at the office, right? So not only does your computer have its own firewall, but the entire network that you are connecting to has a firewall protecting that. And that may be blocking certain ports from going out and connecting to the internet. So as long as you got it working, that's all that really matters. But firewalls are more DevOps than they are actual developer engineering concerns. And it will be interesting to see if that gets covered in module 9 or 10, which I believe is security and DevOps.
Thanks.
Any other questions? One of the downsides of working across all 4 time zones, which remote work has really opened up, is that when you're done on the East Coast at 5 o'clock on a Friday, the team that is on the West Coast is not done at 5 o'clock on Friday. Last chance for questions before we head out. Good work on homework assignments, by the way. I am caught up, or I was caught up at the beginning of this meeting on homework assignments. Everything coming in is looking really good. So keep up that good work. The most important thing that you get in is the last assignment, assignment 51, because that's showing that you know how to get your front end working and how to get your back end working and how to get data from your back end to show up in your front end. So if you only have time for one assignment, that is the one assignment to practice on. And if you get 51 done, you don't have to submit 50, which is just the front end for that. But good work so far on that. Keep that up. I know I have a couple of you booked for Saturday for one-on-ones. So feel free to schedule meetings with me. I am taking Sunday off. Well, relatively off. I'm taking Sunday to prepare for the database module for next week. But feel free to schedule. My Calendly should be up to date for grabbing times for next week as well. And then if you're working on the homework and have any questions, feel free to hit me up on Slack. And I will try and check in on there a couple times this weekend and send answers over there. Otherwise, have a great weekend. Pray for me in prepping the database content, and I will see you all on Monday unless we